Hello and welcome to the Fiction Nonfiction Podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe that every issue in your social media feed or on the evening news has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm Whitney Terrell, author of the novel The Good Lieutenant.
And I'm Jennifer Maritza McCauley, author of Neon Steel. So we are at war with Iran, or maybe having an excursion in Iran. I'm sure you've seen Trump's recent Truth Social on the subject.
Well, I've seen the Truth Social posts. I don't actually go on Truth Social. I have people show them to me. I don't know, Jennifer, maybe you have an account there. But
no, I do not have an account. Okay. I don't have an account.
But his Truth Social posts are bad. The Iranian Lego videos are good, but his Truth Social stuff is like kind of lame. Makes me think of Baghdad Bob.
Oh my God. I can't believe that I'm about to say the sentence, but what does Baghdad Bob have to do with Iranian Lego video?
Baghdad Bob was the Iraqi Minister of Information during the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. And his real name was Mohammed Saeed al-Sahaf, I think, if I've got that right. Pardon my pronunciation. But everyone called him Baghdad Bob. And he became an object of ridicule in the U.S. because he would give these updates about the war that were patently untrue. And we were all like, ha ha, we know so much more than you do. And also his broadcasts looked kind of like they were, like, compared to an American, like, CNN broadcast or something like that, his broadcasts look like something from public access television.
Okay, I get it. But Trump's Truth Social posts look pretty public access compared to Iranians' Lego videos. And the Iranian videos actually seem to be more accurate about what's happening.
Absolutely. We're totally losing the information war as well as the war itself. And the big reason is that I think most of us, and really what I mean by most of us, I mean the administration, but also the American public, don't really understand what's going on in Iran or anything about its history. And our guest today is here to help us get our facts straight. Scott Anderson, along with being a longtime friend of mine, which is probably the most important part of his biography, is a veteran war correspondent who reported from Lebanon, Israel, Egypt, Northern Ireland, Chechnya, Sudan, Bosnia, El Salvador, and many other strife-torn countries. A contributing writer for New York Times Magazine, his work also has appeared in Vanity Fair, Esquire, Harper's, and Outside. He is the author of 2 novels and 6 works of nonfiction, including Lawrence of Arabia, an international bestseller, and most recently, King of Kings, the story of the 1978-79 Iranian Revolution, and a winner of the 2025 Kirkus Prize for nonfiction. He's here to talk to us about that book. Scott, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Whitney. I'm really happy to be here.
So, as we were saying, it's really kind of impossible to understand our current conflict with Iran without understanding the history of the Shah and the Islamic Revolution, which your book covers in more detail than we're ever going to get to in a podcast, right? So the first thing is people should go read the book because we are not going to get as in-depth here. It's not possible. But let's begin where the book begins. A 1977 visit that the Shah made to Washington, D.C. and a protest that you witnessed on the famed ellipse. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it was November 15th, 1977. I was working for the government. I had just come out of high school. I was working at the Treasury Department, which is the headquarters is immediately adjacent to the White House. But I had kind of a no-show federal job. I was the kind of the errand boy for the Secretary of Treasury. And he just never wanted errands run. So I just spent most of my work days just kind of wandering around the city. And on November 15th, the Shah was making it's actually his 7th state visit to the United States, but his first visit to meet Jimmy Carter, who had only been in office for less than a year at that point. The Shah came with a lot of trepidation. He had been a staunch American ally for 30 years. He had human rights issues. He had political prisoners in his country. And of course, Carter had come to office with this kind of reformist idea of clean government, respect for human rights around the world, and also like cutting back on American arms sales abroad. And by 1977, Iran accounted for over half of all American arms sales abroad. So the Shah kind of felt like he had a bullseye on his back. But as it turned out, their meetings went very well because Carter, beyond the image he has as this kind of moralizing do-gooder, He
I
was
just
actually
want to point out, like, is step in there and say, like, we used to arm Iran a lot. You make a very good point of that in the book, which I think people would be surprised to discover.
Well, that's right. And so they still, most of their weaponry is American made, still from the 1970s. So the actual meeting between Carter and them and Carter and the Shah went very well. Carter made it clear that his human rights issues and stuff did not apply to Iran. But what went wrong was that there were about 4,000 anti-Shah demonstrators showed up in Washington, mostly Iranian students studying in American universities. They had this huge demonstration on the Ellipse. And in anticipation of this protest, the Iranian embassy knew this was coming. They had bussed in about 1,500 pro-Shah demonstrators. So the police had separated these two on either side of the Ellipse, which is directly below the White House, as the Shah arrived. And I was kind of standing in the no man's land between the two sides, along with a few policemen and reporters. And all of a sudden, both sides just converged on each other, and it became this pitched battle. I was knocked to the ground at one point, and over 120 people were wounded, injured. It was the biggest civil unrest in Washington in a decade, and the police only kind of restored some order by tear gassing the entire place. And there's a famous set of photos. The Shah and Carter were on this rostrum on the South Lawn of the White House giving speeches, and the tear gas wafted over them. And there's these photographs of both of them kind of wiping tears from their eyes as they're trying to speak. Why it was really disastrous for the Shah was somebody, probably him, had made the decision to show his arrival in Washington on national television in Iran. So the Iranian people saw this live version of the Shah being tear gas, but a huge anti-Shah demonstrations in the streets of Washington. And they took it, a lot of people, the Iranians, took it as a sign that the Americans were backing away from the Shah, because why else let him be embarrassed in the streets of the nation's capital? And so it was really within days of that meeting that you started to see the first anti-Shah demonstrations inside Iran.
That's really great. So you write that the collapse of the Iranian monarch brought an abrupt end to one of the most important economic and military alliances the U.S. has established anywhere in the world. So we're wondering what brought about this collapse. We supported the Shah's regime, and so did the Soviet Union, and the country was rich in oil money at the time. So what could have possibly gone wrong?
Well, so Iran was very much a tale of two countries. It was the Shah was a modernist, a westernizer. He wanted to propel Iran into the 20th century. The Iran of the cities was very cosmopolitan. In Tehran, you saw women in miniskirts. There were massive traffic jams. There were casinos. But literally 10 miles away in the countryside, people were living in mud huts and using animal dung for fuel. And it was also in the countryside deeply religious, where the Shah was increasingly secular. The society he was building was increasingly secular. So that was kind of working away. I think that there's the pace of progress, or if you want to call it progress, the pace of modernization was really a lot of Iranian people was just going too fast. There was a huge disparity between the haves and have-nots. But I think also probably the key to understanding the Iranian Revolution, that on top of the Shah being this kind of out of touch, kind of soft touch autocrat, he was seen as the American Shah. He had, for 30 years, he had propelled this alliance, and he had been the prime mover of this alliance with the United States, to the point where even the people who supported him referred to him as the American Shah. So when the revolution started, and the revolution kind of went in fits and starts for over a year, along with this kind of religious counter-revolution aspect, there was also this element of kind of anti-colonial uprising. And I think that's really what gave it this animating force. And so that the reaction of the Shah, the disapproval of him, expanded beyond the hardcore religious people to pretty much anyone. It was almost a matter of national pride that they just saw the Shah as a lackey of the Americans.
There were also a series of things that the Shah fucked up, basically, that you cover in the book. There's this cinema fire that he handles poorly. There are marches around Eid in 78 that he does a bad job with. And then there's also this big massacre in this square. That's the name I'm forgetting. I should look at my notes.
Jolly Square. Jolly Square in Tehran.
In Tehran.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could just that's those all happen sort of close to each other, but you could talk about how he was messing up the way that once some opposition started appearing in the country, he kind of didn't handle it well.
He handled it really badly. And one thing people say is he would alternate between, taking an iron fist to things or offering up reforms. But in actual fact, he would do the two simultaneously. For example, at one point he declared martial law. But along with declaring martial law, he told his soldiers to only shoot in the most extreme of circumstances and only if their lives were in direct danger. So he was sending hard and soft messages at the same time. And because there was no consistency, I think a lot of the Iranians saw him as running scared. And again, so when the revolution kind of got started, he enacted a series of reforms. He promised to have elections, he wouldn't be affected, but free parliamentary elections the following summer. And this didn't appease the opposition and said these were signs of weakness and further evidence of him being an American lackey, because it's the Shah didn't come up with these ideas. The Americans are telling him to do this. Mm-hmm. So, and he was a man who had always vacillated horribly. He always wanted other people to do his dirty work for him. So when confronted with a true crisis and not having, he had built up this palace culture of sycophants around him. He couldn't really get advice from anybody. He just kind of froze. And he was, kind of like a deer in headlights for month after month after month.
Tell me if I'm saying this right. The Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini?
Yeah. Ruhollah Khomeini, yeah.
Ayatollah Khomeini was a face of my childhood.
Right.
I remember all of these things happening at the time.
Right.
And seeing... It's interesting to read the book and see Zbigniew Brzezinski. Oh, I remember that guy. Okay. Anyway, let's shift to the Khomeini. You give an amazing account of an early encounter that an American, George Braswell, had with him. Maybe you could talk about that and just tell us who he was at this time, prior to the revolution. Where did he come from? How did he get to his position?
So in the early 1960s, the Shah enacted what he called the White Revolution. It was this series of 19 reforms that he wanted to enact. And it was everything from forest reforestation to industrialization to agrarian reform. Almost all the land was in the hands of oligarchic families or in the hands of mosques, the mosque endowments, and the emancipation of women, giving women the right to vote. And those two issues in particular, women's empowerment and agrarian reform, went over like a lead balloon with the arch conservatives of the country, especially the religious. And the man in 1963 who became the spokesman of the ultra right in the Iranian clergy was Ruhollah Khomeini. And he was a seminary teacher in a provincial city outside of Tehran. And what he was saying was so vituperative against the Shah, basically calling the Shah an infidel, that he was essentially, in 1964, the Shah threw him into exile. So he spent 14 years in exile in Iraq. And from Iraq, he was sending sermons, these kind of very fiery sermons calling for the Shah's overthrow, and tape cassettes that were being smuggled back into Iran. So getting to this guy, George Braswell, he was a kind of amazing figure. He went over he was a Southern Baptist proselytizer who picks up in Tehran in 1968, and he gets a job in the theology faculty at the University of Tehran. He's the only American there, the only Christian there, and all the kind of clergy in the theology department kind of take a liking to him. And one of his graduate students says, "Would you like to see, a special type of sermon?" And George says, yeah, sure. So this graduate student takes him to this like cinder block mosque in the ghetto of southern Tehran. And it's a bunch of young seminary students and mullahs that are kind of a lower level priests. And they're gathered around and he hears this tape recorder's playing. And it's Khomeini. And he's saying, I need you people to organize, people to get ready because a revolution is coming. We're going to overthrow the infidel Shah. And this was in 1968. And Braswell said, well, I had never heard of Khomeini, but I figured, of course, the American embassy had, the CIA had a huge station. Surely they knew about this whole underground movement. And as it turned out, wrong, they didn't know anything about it.
One thing that I also noticed about your book was that the CIA sucked during this time.
Oh, my God.
They were wrong about everything.
Everything.
A bunch of idiots.
No, just unbelievable. And in fact, from the inside, the Khomeini's name would not appear in either a CIA report or a cable out of the American embassy for another 7 years. Not until 1975 was the first time official America took any note of Khomeini at all. And the CIA, it had one of its largest stations in the Middle East was in Tehran. Did absolutely no domestic intelligence gathering at all. Instead, got all of its domestic information from the Shah's secret police. It was just handed to him. So, of course, everything was in support of the Shah.
So one of the things I really kind of connected to with your book is your strength in storytelling, I think. And I think that was really well done. So, your book handles real individuals, whether they're civilians, military figures, or political insiders. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the human cost of revolution and what the impact on the individual.
Yeah. So, I mean, the strange thing with the Iranian Revolution is that usually with revolutions, there is this gradual building of intensity, of violence, there's this escalation until you reach a climax. One side or the other wins out. The Iranian Revolution wasn't like that at all. Instead, it kind of went in fits and starts over a 13-month period. There were periods when it looked like the Shah was going to be overthrown at any moment, followed by really long periods when there was virtually no violence in the country at all. So again, it kind of lulled people into this idea that things weren't serious. And part of the mindset of the Americans were horribly ill-informed, especially this being such an important ally. But I think the bedrock idea of the Americans was the Shah has the fifth largest army in the world. If he was in serious trouble, he would put the army out in the streets, kill a bunch of people, and restore order. So the fact that he isn't doing that must mean this is not a crisis. And really, up until a month before the Shah went into exile, President Carter was voicing his full support of him and that he's going to survive and stuff. I mean, the human cost, it's different for, of course, for the Americans or for the Iranian people. I think the Iranian people felt that finally, and again, this is not just the religious right, but it's, kind of Iranians across the spectrum. Iran was a very westernized, very progressive, well-educated country. Far more, universities, this I mentioned before, 50,000 students studying abroad. So this was not North Korea. So they knew what was happening in the world. So I think for a lot of Iranians initially, the idea of getting rid of this autocrat, he was no Saddam Hussein, he was not a brutal autocrat, well, he was brutal enough. That after 30 some odd years, it's just they wanted a change, and also this idea that the Americans were in control of their destiny, I think, really kind of worked to get on that too.
So you also write about a seemingly obscure essay that appeared in a January 7th, 1978 issue of the leading Iranian paper, Italat. Could you talk a little bit about the role that essay played in Khomeini's resurgence, and then read a section of the book to us?
Sure. Yeah, this it's kind of the proverbial flapping of the butterfly wings that starts a hurricane. Basically, very few people outside of, say, the radical clergy or this kind of underground opposition by 1977, 78, had ever heard of Khomeini. His writings were banned in Iran. And he had just been kind of whitewashed out of the country's culture. So, but he would periodicly say nasty things about the Shah and about the Iranian government. And for some reason, in early January 1978, the Shah, it had to have come from the Shah ultimately. He didn't write it, but it had to come from him. They wrote this editorial, this scurrilous editorial attacking Khomeini. And
it's like the Streisand effect.
Yeah. It's bizarre. And it really, so within days of this Etalat article appearing, a bunch of seminary students in Khomeini's hometown rioted. They were met by police. There was a shootout. They killed 6 or 7 of these seminary students. And then in Shia Islam, there is the 40 days after a death is another mourning ceremony, and often it's more emotional and grief-stricken than the day of death, but it's the 40th day anniversary. So the 40th day after the killings in Qom, this city over the editorial, there was a massive riot in a northwest city in Iran, and hundreds were killed in that. The modern part of the city was gutted. And this is what really, at that point, the Iranian Revolution was kind of triggered. On January 4th, 1978, just 3 days after President Carter's lightning visit to Iran ended, the Shah's rubber-stamped Rastaki's political party held its one-day annual Congress in downtown Tehran. Along with reappointing the sitting prime minister, one speaker after another took to the lectern to parrot that season's political slogan, the need to combat an alleged national peril posed by something called, quote, red and black colonialism. In reality, this was merely a light reworking of a narrative the Shah had intermittently promoted for decades, which held that the two political extremes opposed to his rule, the red communists and the black religious arch-conservatives, were working in secret concert. If this wasn't treason enough, these conspirators were also conducting their subversion in the service of a, quote, colonial power that sought to dismember the kingdom. As to the identity of this colonial power, the Shah had always liked to keep that part loose. The Soviet Union was a perennial favorite, but it could be traded out for Great Britain or even the United States, depending on the situation or the mood of the nation. When it came time to pen the editorial for the state-controlled Etalat newspaper, it seemed the British were once again in disfavor. Writing under a pseudonym, the awkwardly worded article took direct aim at Khomeini, effectively accusing him of being the mastermind behind this peculiar alliance of atheistic communists and religious fundamentalists. The writer clearly subscribed to the big lie approach to character assassination, for in addition to a veiled suggestion of homosexuality, he claimed that, quote, by his own admission, Ruhollah Khomeini had lived in India and there had relations with the centers of English imperialism, end quote. Never mind that Khomeini had never been to India and loathed the English nearly as much as he did the Israelis and Americans. Millions of Iranian Muslims, the writer concluded, will ponder how Iran's enemies choose their accomplices as need arises, even accomplices dressed in the sacred and honorable cloth of the clergyman, end quote. The timing of the attack was deeply puzzling, considering that Khomeini had been effectively excised from the consciousness of mainstream Iranian society ever since his 1964 exile. Certainly some of the more conservative faithful knew of him, and might even have heard recordings of his denunciations of the Shah in underground prayer meetings like those attended by George Braswell, but these were a distinct minority. On the other hand, Khomeini had recently stepped up his attacks on the regime, denouncing both Carter's visit to Tehran and the farce of the Rastaki's Party Congress. And it seems someone within Iran's ruling structure finally decided they'd had enough. That someone was almost surely the Shah himself, for given how imperial Iran worked, it is simply inconceivable that an underling would have produced such an inflammatory attack on his own.
Thank you.
You bet.
So, okay. This essay is one. We mentioned various things that the Shah did wrong, and he was out of touch with his people. We're going to get to some similarities between him and our current administration in a later part of this interview. But he has to. The revolution happens. Like, when does Khomeini's is in exile at this time, though. So can you just describe the process of him actually returning to Iran? Like, how did that happen? When did that happen?
So that happened. So what happened is the rebellion against the Shah really became very widespread. Everything from these, the Western educated elite, the progressives, to the conservative people in the countryside. But Khomeini actually really benefited from having been in exile. The Shah, rather than murdering his political opposition, by and large, bought them off. He had a huge payola system, and most of the ayatollahs inside Iran were being paid off to not to support his issues, but to do his programs, but at least keep quiet about it. But Khomeini was removed from all that, so he could be just as vituperative as he wanted to be, and he was very vituperative from exile. So Khomeini had this image of being uncorrupted. Every potential opposition leader inside Iran was corrupted, but he was pure. So that obviously appealed to sort of the religious class. And as the revolution developed, I think even the people on the left thought, okay, we need a figurehead for this. We need one person who kind of is the figurehead for this revolution. And they saw that Khomeini, because he animated the poor people, the rural population, that he was kind of the spiritual guide of the revolution. He was anti-American, which was good. He was religious, and he was a man in his 70s. Surely he had no dreams of or ambitions of political power. So he was even compared to Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi played this role of the spiritual guide of the Indian independence movement, and so Khomeini was kind of cast in that role. Little did they know that he was actually far more ambitious and ruthless than they had figured.
So Khomeini ruled Iran from 1979 until his death in 1989. And for Americans, he's known as the face behind the takeover of the U.S. embassy in Iran, an event that many people, including President Trump, connect to the downfall of Jimmy Carter's presidency. But you argue that what you call the first successful religious counter-revolution against the forces of secularism has global implications far beyond the hostage crisis. Can you talk a little bit about this?
Sure. I've been covering war for 30 some odd years, and most of it in the Middle East. And what I have seen, first of all, I'll talk about the region. The Iranian Revolution changed the chessboard of the Middle East in so many different ways. The rise of religious fundamentalism that you then saw throughout the region. But it really changed the power structure too. All of a sudden, the Americans, in the Iran-Iraq War, were cozying up to Saddam Hussein, who's a vicious psychopath in Iraq, because he's now, the enemy of our enemy is our friend. So it really scrambled the politics and kind of triggered a lot of the wars I've covered. But on an international level, I think what the Iranian Revolution did was really animate. I don't know if it started it, but it animated this fever of religious nationalism that you now see in every faith, and every faith. In this country, Christian nationalists linking up with neo-Nazis, Jewish settlers on the West Bank, even Buddhists. People think Buddhists are so pacifists, and it's the Buddhist monks in Sri Lanka who led the kind of pogrom against the Tamil Hindus. So this spirit of religious inspired nationalism, or the fusion of the two, started with Iran, and it's now epidemic.
I'm sorry that Sugi's not here for the Sri Lanka reference. We don't usually get those to come, naturally into the show without her doing it. So
yeah,
we'll just send her a note.
You rarely have an opportunity to slag Buddhists. So All
right, but so that sort of, in a way that brings us up to present day, and I want to talk about, there are so many. We're going to talk about some of the echoes of this book that I hear about, that I feel are in our current politics. But to set things up a little bit, prior to our decision to start a war with Iran, which we are in now, right? There was widespread protests in Iran that the president spoke about, and he encouraged the protesters, and then it would appear that many of them were murdered by the leaders of Iran. So, what was happening then? What was happening? Can you talk to us about just that period prior to this most recent war that we've started?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought it up, because understanding what happened in January is really key to understanding what's happening now. So what happened is right at the end of December of last year, the Iranian rial was devalued, and it basically caused an economic collapse in Iran, and everybody was kind of gutted by this, deep depression that hit. There have been protests in Iran in the past, usually by progressives against religious laws. The regime has always been able to play off one against the other, but this time because it was an economic collapse, it hit everybody. And what happened initially was people were going out in protests, and the government was stepping back, letting them do it. And day by day, these protests just exponentially grew. And they went from complaining about price hikes or inflation to calling for the regime's overthrow. So after about day 10 of these demonstrations, the regime suddenly realized, I think, or felt, that their very survival is now at stake. There were millions of Iranians taking to the streets, whole families, whole villages taking to the streets in protest. So they changed tactics in a very broad way. Up in those first 10 days, maybe 3 dozen people had been killed. On the weekend of January 8th to January 10th, about anywhere from 30 to 40,000 people were killed. It was a massacre that took place all across the country, and that effectively squashed what had become a movement for regime change. So that is the background for what you come to during the American attack. So the Netanyahu and Trump are thinking there's going to be a popular uprising in Iran once the bombs start dropping. That's not going to happen. They did that 2 months earlier, and people were slaughtered. The only way you get the beginning of a popular uprising or a regime change is if they have help from the outside, meaning foreign troops on the ground. And the only foreign troops that are going to do that are Americans, right? So there is no popular uprising in March. And what's also key, and all the Americans and Israelis also didn't understand, is that the regime, having stared their own destruction in the face in January, have very little negotiating room. The Iranian regime really is despised by the vast majority of Iranian people at this point. So there's no peaceful transition to something else. These people get their throats cut if they surrender. So they have nothing to lose. And so this is why they are not surrendering, and I mean, their very survival is at stake, or so they see it. And this was just a massive miscalculation by Trump and by Netanyahu.
Iran's leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, was killed in the U.S.-Israeli airstrikes that we just mentioned, and his son, Mojtaba Khomeini, has now taken power. What is their connection, if any, to the Ayatollah Khomeini?
So Khomeini, it's confusing. No, it's okay, but it's confusing because their names are almost identical, Khomeini and Khamenei.
Yeah.
So Khomeini was, when Khomeini died in 89, the role of spiritual leader passed to Khomeini, and so it's supreme leader. So, and basically, under the theocracy that Khomeini created, the supreme leader is God's voice on earth. He's God's mouthpiece on earth. So he's infallible. He is standing in the place of God. But what you have in Iran is it's everything about Iran is complicated. But so you have this kind of three-way power structure. You have the Ayatollahs. You have the supreme leader. You have a civilian government that's elected, and so at the moment there's actually a rather moderate Iranian president, but who doesn't have the power that the supreme leader has. And then the real power is the Revolutionary Guard, basically the military. And you're talking about close to 1 million men who, they're no longer the fifth most powerful army in the world, but they have machine guns and they have drones. And so again, these are people who they have a vested interest in seeing the regime survive. So it's very different from, say, Saddam Hussein in Iraq, where you had this pyramid structure where if you took out Saddam Hussein, you had maybe a few thousand people who were truly loyal to him. But in Iran, it's millions of people who have a vested interest in seeing the regime continue. That's what, and again, seems to be something that Trump just had, no clue of.
So, Scott, is that perhaps the reason why you have an essay? Well, actually, this we're recording on a Saturday, but your essay is going to run Monday, and this episode will not come out until Thursday, so it'll already be out. People can look it up. But you're at this point going to publish an op-ed in the Times titled "Trump's humiliation in Iran is inevitable."
You're right.
I mean, would you care to elaborate?
Sure, I'd love to elaborate. Basically, once there was no popular uprising and the Iranian regime didn't fold, the Americans are left with two options. The one being the one that Trump was advocating, which is just lay waste to the entire country. But by kind of voicing that ahead of time, he kind of alerted people to, you know what, that's a whole bunch of war crimes. And the other is it's cut a deal with Iran. The key thing is it doesn't matter how much bombing you do of Iran. The thing you cannot take away from them is their drones. And the drone is, as it's been proven in the war in Ukraine, the drone is the modern equivalent of the machine gun of World War I. It has utterly changed the face of modern warfare. Now, they're incredibly cheap. So $1,000 drone can take out a $5 million tank. So it's utterly changed the equation of warfare. Likewise, with all of Trump's saber rattling and talk of the blockade on the Persian Gulf, he's intimated like a ground invasion if the Iranians don't do what he wants them to do. Well, you could put 50,000 Marines on the shore of the Persian Gulf, and the Iranians will still have the capability of sending a drone over their head, hitting an oil tanker in the Persian Gulf, and paralyzing the whole region again. Iran now, as it exists now, has to be brought into the equation of reopening the Persian Gulf. It's as simple as that, and that's because of drones. So let's take that one step further. It essentially means the Iranians win. Trump is going to. So
our blockade of their blockade of the Straits of Hormuz is not going to work. That's not a good strategy.
No, because you can still send a drone over. They have tens of thousands of drones. All it has to happen is it's happened in Israel. The Israelis have had this Iron Dome shield that is supposed to be impervious to air attack, and the Iranians send enough over, a few get through, and a few people get killed. So again, all you need to do is hit one oil tanker in the Persian Gulf, and everything stops again. So the Iranians have not only a seat at the table, but who's anxious for this thing to end? It's Trump, because every day, gas is going up, grocery prices are going up in the United States, his approval ratings are dropping. So he wants to end this thing as soon as possible. The Iranians could drag this out for months if they want to, and they do want to. So my feeling is what the last move that the Iranians did was really very clever. Now they're talking about, okay, we'll reopen the Straits of Hormuz, but the whole issue of our uranium stockpiles will push down the road. I bet, and of course, this is the sensible reason why we started bombing Iran in the first place, is to recover the uranium stockpile. I should go on call sheet and make a bet, because I'm absolutely convinced that within a few weeks, Trump he's going to tart it up, with a couple of lies, but he's basically going to take the Iranian offer. And, he's going to say, I talked to the supreme leader on the phone, and he said, oh dear sir, you've hurt us so badly. Of course, we're not going to build an atomic bomb, and you can take my word for it. Or he's going to say, our bombing has been so effective that the uranium stockpiles can never be recovered.
It's just dust now. It's just uranium dust.
Yeah, that's right. It'll be one or the other. It'll be one or the other. But yeah, I think it's kind of already a done deal.
I just want to say one quick thing. Jennifer has a question, but I just want to make an observation that, as you know, we both wrote about the war in Iraq, and I've studied the IEDs and the American troops who were tasked to sort of try to deal with those. The worst ones were built by Iran, and it was asymmetric warfare. Those were cheap. They could take out Humvees. They could take out tanks. It's the exact same thing. I mean, the technology's gotten better, but the idea that we don't understand that our high-tech weapon systems are vulnerable to asymmetric warfare in these kinds of situations is not learning.
No, it's right. And, frankly, it goes back to, September 11th. I mean, September 11th was done with box cutters. It wasn't any sophisticated stuff. I think we're always the Goliath, but we don't anticipate what the Davids out there are capable of.
So you wrote and conceived this book long before this current war between the U.S. and Iran. But reading it, I felt an extraordinary number of parallels between the history of the Shah, his rise, his corruption, and seemingly omnipotent power, and Donald Trump's presidency. When you were writing the book, did you feel any of that?
Well, I've certainly felt it since Trump came back in. I did most of the writing of the book, actually, when Biden was president. I almost finished it when Trump was reelected, but I certainly felt it, in the last year and a half, that both men have surrounded themselves with sycophants. They live in an echo chamber of their own making. They think they know best, and people around them are constantly telling them that they're best. The one huge difference I find between the Shah was brilliant. I mean, even his enemies recognized he was a brilliant man, which kind of begs the question of why he would create this palace culture where everybody fawned on him and lied to him about the inflation rate and stuff, because if the inflation rate was 17%, they'd say, oh, it's 5%, because they didn't want to suffer his wrath. That's very different than Trump. I don't think Trump is smart enough to know that he's not very smart. But he will lie about the inflation rate. He keeps saying that it's low or everything's going fine. That's true. No, he's very good at lying, and I think that's why he's going to try to get out of Iran. He's a carnival barker, and what he's always done is when he just changes attention, he changes the focus to something else. I thought it was interesting. About 3 weeks into the Iran war, all of a sudden they started talking about Cuba. And there's about 3 days there where all of a sudden all the focus is on Cuba. So he's a master at deflection. But one thing I've seen a lot of people say is he and Hegseth have gotten rid of. I mean, surely people in the CIA and the Pentagon could have predicted what exactly has now happened in Iran. I'm surely there's enough kind of. I mean, I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt, frankly, but surely some people realize this was going to be a huge mistake. But those people have been, cashiered. They've been forced out of office. The difference, though, is I think even if they hadn't there hadn't been this purging of the CIA and of the Pentagon, Trump wouldn't have listened to experts anyway. He always thinks he knows best, and this goes back to him being kind of dumb. I mean, he doesn't have the wherewithal to realize that he actually doesn't know that much. And this is an aside, but I don't know if you saw the video of him at the state dinner with King Charles, where King Charles made a joke. He said, "Oh, we had a tea party here, and it was much more welcoming than the Boston Tea Party," and people laughed. And Trump kind of looked around the room and what are why people are laughing? And sort of chuckled. It's like he'd never heard of the Boston Tea Party. It's like he had no idea what they were talking about.
I also just recall there were just moments where you were describing the Shah building statues of himself all over the place. And, there is this weird authoritarian desire to see your image. Trump definitely has that. He also had the Shah seemed to have a real interest in sporting events and that kind of stuff is very similar. You know, the spectacle of those things.
Yeah.
And the vast difference between the people in the countryside who are poor and the wealthy class that the Shah was surrounding himself with is also, to me, very similar.
Yeah, that's right. No, you're absolutely right. Yeah.
And here's another echo that I wanted to just get your last comment on. This surprised me. I did not know this. I guess I had forgotten this or hadn't thought about it. But you point out that prior to the era, the Shah's time, which is the rise of OPEC, we're not going to explain the whole history of OPEC, but it's a conglomeration of Middle Eastern countries that got together to set the price of oil. But prior to that period, the United States actually had produced 85% of the world's oil. We had not, we didn't have problems getting oil. And then we pumped our wells dry. And that was what created such dependency on Iran and the Middle East for oil. And yet we're hearing the same thing now. Trump is always like, well, we don't need the oil. We got plenty of oil. We don't, it's fine. But this isn't always going to be true, is it? I mean, we're just going to end up.
No, but I mean, to my mind, it's also a sign of his stupidity. We may not need the oil right now. We don't get any oil from Iran, but all our allies do. All our all our Asian consumer countries who buy American goods, they buy Iranian oil. So if their economies go belly up, what happens to American corn and wheat sales to Asia? He doesn't see beyond this tiny little narrow focus, and has just this kind of absolute refusal to realize how much the globe is interdependent now. And he's doing everything he can to cut that interdependency, but you can't. I mean, there is a world economy, and we're seeing it here, right? I mean, why? So why have gas prices gone up $1.50 a gallon since the beginning of March? So we are being affected by the war on Iran.
Scott, thanks so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to talk to you. Listeners, be sure to pick up a copy of King of Kings at an independent bookseller near you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks, Whit.